When you think about it, George Raft was one of the greatest sort of Hollywood hardmen of a generation, wasn't he? I liked all of his films, and I loved the way that he strode around as if he was like 6'4" or whatever. When you realise he was quite a diminutive man, wasn't he? I don't mean that rudely, but the way he tilted his trilby and everything, he just sort of oozed power. There were a lot of them around that time, weren't they? Peter Lorre was menacing, wasn't he, on camera, and yet probably quite a nice guy off camera. Humphrey Bogart, all he needed to do was put the collar up of his gabardine coat and suddenly he meant business, right? Tilted the hat and all of that. Now, what's fascinating, I find, is when I look back at some of the people, as I say, I've been lucky enough to interview, this particular gentleman had the honour of his father actually working and writing for the brilliant George Raft. Now, many people may remember that we did a movie a while back all about when George Raft opened his club here in London, which literally fell foul of the law because a lot of people felt there was something rather sinister behind that club. You know, it's incredible, isn't it, when you look at it? You know, I mean, what could have possibly gone wrong? We're talking, of course, about the middle 60s, and at this point, George Raft really isn't the biggest box office star in the world, but he still has a lot of clout. And a lot of people wanted still to book him. Part of the reason why he was over here on this particular interview, relayed by this wonderful man whose father was called George Martin. Yes, not the brilliant Beatles producer, but a comedian, billed as the casual comedian. And he went from being a very successful comedian on radio and in variety theatre, and then became one of the chief writers on shows like, you know, Sunday Night at the London Palladium. Hence the reason he got to work and meet with George Raft. But what was interesting was, as George came over here, as I say, to try and get his career going, literally he was booked on so many different things. As long as they were paying, George was there. I'll let this man pick up the story, but it's a lovely story of how exactly George was still looking for work and working hard, even at that point in his career.
Because you had a very successful Radio 2 show, and one of the guests, correct me if I'm right, was one of my all-time favourite gangsters, George Raft. I mean, I could watch any George Raft film. I think he's just brilliant, but I don't know if you've noticed this, Mike. Yeah, when you look at George Raft now and you see him walking, he's quite short, you know, so you think, why are people frightened of George Raft? He's about this high, you know. So, what happened? How did he get on his radio show?
High on the big screen.
Yes, that's the thing, isn't it? But your dad obviously had very good connections with people, you know. Do you know how that came around? Was he a guest on that show?
Yes, the George Raft situation came about because, I mean, you mentioned just now Sunday Night at the London Palladium, which they're repeating at the moment on Talking Pictures. And my dad wrote many of those, the early ones. You see his name on the credits still, especially the ones with Jimmy Tarbuck.
Yeah.
And George Raft was over here doing business, apparently. In fact, I don't know if you know.
I know about the club,
kicked out of the country in the end because of nefarious dealings. It was that period. But of course, he was an enormous star who everybody remembered. And so they had him as a guest on the London Palladium show, doing a dance and doing a two-hander with Tarbuck. My dad wrote all that stuff. Wow. And so that was at the time of my dad's radio show. So that was how he came to be on my dad's radio show as well. There's a show called Souvenir.
Yeah.
And Dad said he was lovely. He was a gentleman, but don't know what else he was up to on the side. But
You know, finally, I've got to ask, Mike, because I could talk to you for hours, but sadly, time is always against us. For those that are not aware of your father, who's obviously had a very illustrious life, when they buy your book, what do they find out? What would they not know after watching us now having a gossip? But what would they find out reading the book? Is there something that you would like them to take away from the book, you know?
I would just, as I say, it was a labour of love. It's kind of bittersweet in a way. I haven't sort of tried to hide anything. There's certain things I haven't put in there, obviously, but it's my relationship with him, you know. So warts and all. I mean, you know, I'd like people to take away the fact that he was a great guy, and he made his mark in show business of the time. Perhaps not the greatest dad in the world, but he was a great guy.
Yeah.
And I loved him, and I still love him, and I just want it to be a tribute to him. you know, I just had to get it out there, really. And I hope there's still enough people around who are interested enough to read his story, because apart from anything else, I think I've painted the picture of show business at the time, what it would have been like going through it. And just the story of a guy who had a career in show business.
Trevor, thank you so much for taking the time out to join me and listen to a wonderful memory. I hope it just gets the sort of thought process going. That's the whole point of nostalgia, isn't it? You think of things, you might look up a movie, maybe you went to see them at your local cinema. It's about sort of just generating different thoughts of the day rather than focusing on all the bad stories that come our way. Do you agree? That, if you can, please do like and share these videos. I love making them for you. I know that sadly they're not as popular as the gossipy ones, but you know, if you could like and share, comment, I would be really grateful. And let me know, were you a George Raft fan? What sort of movie did you like him in? There were so many, weren't they? Brilliantly done. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.